Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry De Silva. Well, today we've got more than just a book about sports. We've actually got a book that talks about several folks, including some that, to be honest with you, I wasn't even that familiar with, but that have some tremendous stories, not just about their days in their respective profession in the world of sports, but also really that journey was just the beginning of their lives. I always think of like tennis players that, you know, by the time they're 30, they may be washed up, and then that's just really the early part of their lives. In the case of these folks that we're going to be talking about today with two authors, their journey really in many cases, and also their success and goals in life really in many cases have come later on after their athletic careers are over. The book that we have today is a book called Champions, 15 Inspiring Comeback Stories from Sports and Life. The authors are George Castle, our old friend who's been on with us before, as well as a gentleman named John Schenk, who is co-authored with George. Before we get to those gentlemen, we've got a short little video clip that tells you a little bit about the book, as well as also shows you some of the folks that are talked about and that we'll be talking about in the book. So let's roll that.
It's been a penthouse to the outhouse and back kind of story.
Everybody thinks that since you're an athlete, everything works out for you. But there's some stuff that you have to go through that it's monumental from time to time, but I was able to get through it.
I tore my ACL fifth match into my professional career. 3 years later, I was able to go back and win an Olympic gold medal.
These stories are stories that people will love, regardless of whether they like the Cubs or that specific team, or even if they're a sports fan. These are stories that people can relate to.
If I can just make a difference in one person's life, then I've done my job.
And now you've got a little taste of what we're going to be talking about and whom we're going to be talking about. So let me first bring back a returning guest, veteran sports author from the Chicago area, George Castle. George, welcome back to Studio 411.
I feel it's my home away from home, Larry. Thanks for having me on again.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And joining us from Dallas, Texas, via Skype, John Schenk, who co-authored the book with George. John, pleasure to have you with us. Welcome aboard.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Tell me, how did you two guys, given that you're not exactly neighbors, how did you two guys, we'll start with George, you know, hook up to even consider doing this project? George, take it away.
Well, an author does books and gets book projects by every unusual means possible. And I got to meet John through an old friend of mine who had been the circulation manager of a newspaper I had worked at for 25 years. His name is John Wroblewski. I call him Johnny W. And he said that he knew a promotion-minded sports guy, John Schenk, who wanted to do a book, and a book on that could be marketed to young people to be able to teach them some pretty good values. And so we were hooked up that way, and we both found out that we were old baseball fans. John a little bit less old of a baseball fan than I am. The either end of the I-55 rivalry, John with the Cardinals and me with the Cubs. So we got to working on this book early in 2016, and we both threw out different potential subject matters of athletes and sports figures who had challenges in their lives and in essence had to make a comeback on and off the field of play. And I had covered a number of these people that we profiled. John knew some other people and knew their backstory. A couple of them are pretty close to you there in Connecticut. A couple of New York Mets catchers who were battling for the backup spot behind Gary Carter in 1986. And my personal thing is, well, I don't really care about the Mets in 1986 or 69. There's some old wounds there. But when I got to meet and talk to Barry Lyons and Ed Hearn, their stories didn't matter where they had been playing. They were just as fascinating as the other people that were profiled, and certainly it was a team effort.
Absolutely. And then I turn to John. John, tell us about, again, the prospect of how the book came together. Obviously, George touched on it a little bit. I could tell just by reading the book, I could see George's influence in terms of some of the subject matter, the individuals, again, Cub references, etc., and then some of the more obscure ones that, again, were new to me, even the ones that he talks about that are closer to my neck of the woods, such as Victoria Arlen, who, of course, works now for ESPN. But again, kind of what was your input as far as selecting certain stories? Where there are some that really hit home with you?
Well, the whole concept of this book came about over the last several years. I've been working with many professional athletes in terms of marketing and promotion events, helping them a lot of these guys that go out and do public speaking, we help them with that process. And so I'm very familiar with a lot of their stories. And, as more and more stories broke about how professional athletes are, these millionaires that don't care about people, or they're self-absorbed, or, some of these other connotations that people have on professional athletes, I really wanted to show people that...
I guess, I don't know, is that a good omen? I don't know. Is that?
It's like,
I know. I think we have a ghost in the room. I don't. For those.
It's been there for a while. It's never fallen. So I don't know what just happened.
George,
but
I think George just sent you a telepathic message. George, did you just knock that picture off the wall?
That's revenge for all these Cardinals and Mets, you call it Cardinal and Mets indignities heaped on the Cubs, and costing me both sleep and some money over the decades.
My goodness. John, hold up that picture there that you have of champions. Hold it up nice and straight so we can see it. So there you go. There's the book. And actually, just to digress a second, share with us, you've got some of those that I know were available that were signed. I see our past guest and friend Marv Levy's on there. Tell the viewer who the others are on the front cover that have signed that lovely picture that had magic of its own.
Yeah, so you've got Marv Levy in the upper left corner there. Right here, you've got Imani McGee Stafford, a WNBA player in Atlanta. She just got, she was in Chicago last season. She's in Atlanta this season. Phenomenal story of overcoming a lot of challenges in her personal life leading up to even the WNBA. You've got Hall of Fame pitcher Fergie Jenkins in the lower left corner. Who, as most Chicago fans, just adore him for the many accomplishments he got on the field, but also you might be surprised with what he's overcome off the field. And then in the bottom right corner, you've got Victoria Arlen, as who you mentioned, is an ESPN reporter now, and her story is probably one of the most remarkable stories in this whole book. I mean, all the stories are great, but her story, I think I haven't met a single person that's read her story and has walked away saying, anything other than this is incredible, what she overcame. I mean, it's just truly incredible.
To jump ahead now that I'm still recovering from the picture falling, what in your opinion is the common thread of all the participants and the stories in this book, in your opinion, John?
Well, I think that it shows that whether you're a baseball player, basketball player, or whatever sport you participate in, whether you're a Olympic medalist, I mean, all of them, they all share the same obstacles, the same challenges off the field. They're all humans. They all suffer, and they all have to overcome these obstacles to be able to continue on in their professional lives. And I think that this book does a good job showing people, even if you're not a sports fan, I think that people look at this book and say these are stories of true challenges, of overcoming true life events. And I think that speaks a lot to people who may not know that about a lot of these athletes, who may think these athletes just go on the field and win ball games. But really, what they've accomplished on the field is a very small part of what they've truly accomplished in life. And so I think that all these athletes coming from such diverse backgrounds really show that doesn't matter what sport you're in, how much money you make, what medals you win, life can still be very challenging at times.
Absolutely. We were fortunate enough to, not long ago, to have your colleague here, George, along with Pro Football Hall of Fame coach Marv Levy, join us via phone in Chicago. And George wrote the foreword to this book. Not George, I beg your pardon, Marv did. George wrote the book along with John. I just wanted to read something that Marv said. I always say that in order to succeed, you need good PR. P for preparation and R for resilience. Those are the keys. And once I got reading about all these different athletes, some Hall of Fame caliber, some not, but a Hall of Fame in the manner of life overall, I would say that. But as Marv said, those are the key, preparation and R for resilience. Let's touch a little bit on some of the sports individuals that you gentlemen both feature in the book. We'll spend a few minutes on each one and try to get them all in. We'll go to George because my hunch tells me that he probably knows a tremendous amount, and we'll try to keep it to 2 to 3 minutes on each. Bob Love, Bulls great, the Michael Jordan, before Michael Jordan, if you want to call it that. At that point, all-time leading scorer, but before Jordan and the crew came along in the 80s. However, lifelong stutterer, and George, pick it up from there. Had some difficulties, but overcame them.
Yeah, I know John has gotten to know Bob in his older years. They're very, very close. I watched Bob Love play in person and paid only $3.50 in the upper balcony at the old Chicago Stadium. If you can believe an NBA ticket costs that little, that's what it was. Bob Love scored 25 points a game. He was a sublime player, a great scorer, and a ferocious defender. Right out of the Jordan mold, he could play on Michael's team. He was that tough. The problem is, off the court, he couldn't communicate. On the court, he was fine with signals, point to me, I'm open. But off the court, he literally could not talk. And I'll give you one quick example. In 1973, at the peak of his career, Bob Love was invited on a Chicago sports talk show. The host, Pat Sheridan, thought he snared a really, really good guest, the top scorer on the Bulls. But he also knew that Bob was a stutterer and did very, very few broadcast interviews. As much as Bob wanted to communicate, it just didn't come out on the radio. And at the time, I had a brand new Webcore tape cassette recorder. And so, knowing what was coming, knowing Bob's story already as a teenager, I ran the tape. The host just strung poor Bob out to dry and allowed him these pregnant pauses where there was nothing coming out of his mouth. And Bob told me for the narrative that after that interview, live on radio on a 50,000-watt NBC-owned station, going out to 38 states, he really wanted to just crawl into a hole, and that hurt him at a time where black athletes were starting to get money and endorsements off the field. And if you can't speak, you can't do a TV commercial, you can't do a speaking engagement. And Bob declined to the point where after his NBA career was finished, he couldn't get gainful employment. He ended up as a busboy at the Nordstroms in Seattle. He had played for the old Supersonics as his last NBA stop. And he did the best he could. He was really, really knocked down to the point where it was a subsistence living. Fortunately, John Nordstrom, the head of the company, found out about him and paid for speech lessons. And Bob started on his comeback. And to make a long story short, in the early 90s, he was hired as director of community involvement or community relations with the Bulls. His job was to be the chief community speaker for the team. And as Bob will tell you, he's spoken to what he thinks are millions of people over the years about the challenges he's had and the challenges all the kids have who are listening to him. So It's not how you start, it's how you finish.
Indeed, indeed. And I was surprised. I didn't even remember that he played with the old New York or New Jersey Nets for a cup of coffee back. I assume it was in the late 70s. But again, marvelous story about a fine individual. Studio 411, Larry DeSilva is my name. Champions the book, 15 inspiring comeback stories from sports and life. For more information, www.signaturestrengthpublishing.com. George Castle joining us from Chicago, and John Schenk, we welcome him joining us from Dallas, talking about these fine uplifting stories and these athletes. John, we'll turn it over to you. Ferguson Jenkins, of course, more my era, Cubs Hall of Famer, Cy Young Award winner, 6-time 20-game in a row winner, actually 7-time 20-game winner, ironically, if George will correct me. I think his high in wins was 25 with the Texas Rangers, and I thought he would have done that with the Cubbies, but just shows how great his career was. But had issues with anger as well as tragedy in his life during his playing days. One thing that wasn't talked about in the book, and I just bring it up between you two gentlemen, I know one thing that I remember made the news here in this part of the country was at one point there was a drug arrest at one point in his life, so that kind of, I think might have held up his Hall of Fame inductee or induction, I should say, for a couple of years. Tell me a little bit about your experience with Ferguson Jenkins.
Well, Fergie is one of the most class act, gentle gentlemen that you can meet today. His love for the sport, the love for baseball is still very evident. And he does so many events around Chicago and elsewhere, and people just love him. I mean, he's a very humble guy. But what you see in his on-field accomplishments really show that he was probably one of the best pitchers. And I don't think anybody will ever beat some of the records that Fergie made. But I think that one thing that really sticks out in his story, as I was reading it and listening to him share it, was the tragedy of losing a wife, of losing a daughter from a caregiver that ultimately did a murder-suicide. These tragedies that most people can't even comprehend, and he was dealing with this during and after his professional career. And so the fact that he dealt with those challenges, still becomes one of the best pitchers that Major League Baseball has ever seen and probably will ever see, and still goes out and and just encourages kids. Really, I mean, the smile on these kids' faces when they get to meet him is just huge. And so he goes out there and he does these things today, and he takes that tragedy, and he's not bitter. He's not like a lot of those people that may not have been able to deal with that grief. He really goes out there, still grieving, I'm sure, but really just pulls people in. And so his story, I mean, like I said, overcoming these things and still becoming one of the best pitchers in baseball is one of the most inspiring things. It just shows us how we can overcome whatever we're challenged with. We can overcome it and still be one of the best in whatever we do.
Absolutely. Now, between the two of you gentlemen, who was the one that dealt with our next subject, Victoria Arlen? Was that more George that was contacted her, or was that?
And it was a team effort, but I did the interview, Larry, and let me tell you, you're barking up the right tree when at the beginning of the show when you talked about Victoria, in that when we had the book party on February 22nd, people were attracted to her like bees to honey. She is an absolutely vivacious, beautiful woman, just sparkles with personality, and people really, really, really like her and her story. And I think she was the most popular person at that party, and her story is absolutely fantastic. It's literally out of a TV movie, and it just shows you. It's a lesson to medical professionals. I'll take it from the top here. Victoria was just a vivacious young girl out of Exeter, New Hampshire, so she's just up the road from you in Connecticut. Exeter was the scene of a famous UFO incident, and they wrote a book about it in 1965. But that's a long, long time ago. So in this case, she had some sort of disease at age 12 or 13 that was misdiagnosed. And if it had been diagnosed correctly, she wouldn't have had to go through her ordeals. She fell into a coma-like state right when she was a teenager, but she could hear what was going on around her. And you had medical professionals who were telling Victoria's parents, why are you putting so much effort into this? They were in essence telling her it's such a hopeless case. Victoria couldn't speak, she couldn't move, but she heard what was said. Lesson number one, if you're a medical professional, a doctor, nurse, therapist, whatever, you've got a comatose patient. Don't assume they can't hear you or understand. Eventually, she recovered. She was still paralyzed. She was in a wheelchair, but she took up Paralympic swimming and won a world championship in it. And she was a personality just waiting to be freed from the limits of her physical disability. She worked and worked and worked at getting her movement back. Certainly swimming helped her. And even while she was still in a wheelchair, she applied to ESPN. And you don't think in this business a 21-year-old is going to get hired at a major national network. Lo and behold, she got hired at age 21, the youngest talent ever hired by ESPN, and she has absolutely thrived. And in the meantime, to complete her comeback, she not only can walk, but she hopes to run and compete in running events. And I think one of the best photos we got was her interviewing Michael Phelps poolside before she had gained all her mobility. So in essence, two superstars in their own right. And her comeback is absolutely stunning. And just again, the star of the show at our book unveiling February 22nd.
We've got a shot of Victoria with former President Barack Obama. At this point, she was still recovering from her injuries or her illness, and now, of course, as one of our staffers reminded me, she in the last year or two competed on Dancing with the Stars, so she's really come full circle. A 2012 Summer Paralympic gold and silver medalist. And as you said before, scary to think, as she describes vividly in the book to you gentlemen, how, as you said, she could hear but couldn't see, couldn't communicate until a certain point in time. And then, there's always that age-old discussion whenever someone is in that kind of vegetative state. Well, when do we do this, or when do we possibly do that? So it's a slippery slope, to say the least. George Castle, along with John Schenk, joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. The book Champions, 15 Inspiring Comeback Stories from Sports and Life, by Signature Strength Publishing, signaturestrengthpublishing.com. Let's move on to our next subject that you guys talk. Again, another gentleman that I wasn't that familiar with, and marvelous story, Scott Taszynski, hopefully I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, 2008 Olympic men gold medal winner. John, we'll talk to you about it. 2004 ACL knee tear, told he would never play professionally again. And as we just said, 4 years later, wins Olympic gold. So another success story, and has now moved on to some other things in his life.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott's story is one that I think a lot of people can relate to. He tears his ACL. He's told that he will never play volleyball again, much less at the professional level. 4 years later, there's a picture of him on the volleyball court kissing the gold medal as they won the Olympic men's volleyball in Beijing for those Olympics. And that just shows that the hard work, the motivation to overcome some of those physical setbacks can be achieved if you really set your mind to it. And now he's out coaching in California. He's a assistant volleyball coach at one of the universities out there, and so he's able to kind of pass it along and encourage people. And for the last several years, since he retired from volleyball, he's been out there doing sports camps, volleyball camps. So every summer he travels across the United States giving these camps and really encouraging these kids to continue on and to overcome some of the injuries and challenges they might face, because he's the perfect example of overcoming what doctors said wasn't able to be overcome.
Indeed, indeed. We'll move on a little bit because, again, we've got so many of these fine subjects to talk about, and unfortunately, even in a little under an hour, the time just doesn't allow. Help me so that I'm pronouncing this gentleman's last name. We'll go to George on this one. Chris Krug, is that how you pronounce his last name?
Chris Krug.
Krug. Krug, thank you. A not so successful Major League Baseball career. Years later, blossomed into a success story as a sports landscaper, and has a connection to a very famous movie, one that actually voted, I believe, the American Film Institute, one of the 100 greatest movies of all time. George, tell us a little bit about Chris.
Well, he started out with kind of a ball four type of motif. Again, he was a 25-year-old catcher trying to stick in the major leagues with the Cubs in 1965. Well, it's tough enough to face Sandy Koufax with his best stuff. But on September 9th, 1965, not only did Chris Krug try to hit Koufax unsuccessfully, but he threw the ball in the left field on a steal of third by Sweet Lou Johnson of the Dodgers, and that stood up as the only run in Koufax's perfect game victory over the Cubs, 1-0. Opposing pitcher Bob Kennedy, or Bob Henley, I should say. Bob Kennedy had been the Cubs manager prior to that, but Chris Krug did a great job handling Bob Henley in that Henley allowed one hit. So the one hit in the game was a record for all Major League games. One hit the entire game, and that had nothing to do with the run. But Krug was the GOAT. He threw the ball in the left field past Ron Stano, and Lou Johnson scored for the only run. It had been a double no-hitter through the seventh. And after that season, Krug ran into Koufax at a golf tournament, and Sandy was the most magnanimous winner in history. He really respected all his opponents, good and mediocre. And he told Chris it wasn't your fault. And I would say that should have cured him. But then he had a new manager come into Chicago, Leo DeRocher. Leo did not believe in positive reinforcement. So one day, Chris is trying to hang on as the backup catcher behind rookie Randy Hundley in 1966. And he's warming up one of the pitchers, and a pretty blonde woman starts talking to him. She's sitting in the first row of the box seats. And Krug just innocently talked back to her. Leo, whenever there was a woman involved, he saw all and heard all. And he later called a team meeting saying, you know, I've been a Romeo here, I've been a Romeo at the hotel. I'm cleaning up Leo's language, as you could figure. But never have I tried to be a Romeo with the owner's wife. The pretty blonde woman was the wife of Bill Wrigley, the son of Cubs owner Phil Wrigley at the time. And pretty soon Chris Krug found himself banished to the minor leagues. And he resurfaced briefly with the San Diego Padres in 1969, but pretty much that derailed his career, and it wouldn't have helped anyway because Randy Hundley became an Iron Man catcher. He catched double headers in the late 60s. Well, Krug soon found himself a new calling. He started building baseball fields with Gary Adams, a friend of his who was the coach of the UCLA baseball team. And at one time, they got a contract with a film company to build a baseball field out of a cornfield. Whoever thinks that you'd build a baseball field in the middle of miles and miles of cornfields? This is in Dyersville, Iowa. The film is Field of Dreams. And so he built the most iconic baseball field this side of any major league ballpark. And I've used the photo of Chris Krug and Kevin Costner on the set many a time in books and in articles.
Very good.
So that's a nice little comeback story there.
Absolutely.
From being the GOAT and being exiled by Leo DeRocher.
Well, Leo was no saint. If you recall, when he was a New York Giant manager, he was romancing actress Lorraine Day back in the late 40s and 50s. Later married her, so maybe Leo.
And he was romancing other women while he was married to Lorraine
yes,
Day.
there you go. So maybe
right now I'm
that's
working on another project in which Leo had some fun with a woman 1/3 of her age. 2 weeks after he married his fourth wife, Lynn Walker Goldblatt DeRocher, in 1969, but that's another story.
Wow. Oh, he's always got those Leo DeRocher stories, John, let me tell you. Oh, my goodness. Champions, 15 inspiring comeback stories from sports and life. John Schenk, along with George Castle, joining us, signaturestrengthpublishing.com. John, let's toss it over to you. A young lady that I never heard in my life. You touched upon her briefly during your intro. Imani McGee Stafford seems like a wonderful lady. 6'7", WNBA, University of Texas. Sexually abused by a relative beginning at age 8. 3 suicide attempts between 10 and 15 years of age. My goodness, this young lady, in those first dozen and a half years, led more of a tragic life than most of us in a lifetime. How did she come back to the other side and become such a success story?
Imani's story is one that is one of my favorite stories in this book, in the sense of there's not a single young female that I don't think can relate to some aspect or another of Imani's story. Being born into a family, she has several siblings, watching her parents go through a divorce. In fact, seeing her parents' divorce papers and seeing some of the stories within them at a very young age is difficult enough, and seeing why your parents are kind of splitting ways. But beyond that, being sexually abused multiple times by a family member, the devastating effects of the sexual abuse that came with that. As her life kind of went on and she continued to grow up, she obviously wasn't like her peers. She was very tall, she's very athletic, didn't necessarily fit in well. But with all those kind of elements combined and some others, she just couldn't see the point of living. And those suicide attempts are something that we're seeing more and more in the media with the recent suicide attempts of celebrities, and it's a humbling and scary thought to know that people, even that are this talented and this athletic, go through those same things. And I think that just the fact that she was able to overcome that and still continue on and go to college and become a college athlete, be very successful as a college athlete, and in her academic studies, and then go on to the WNBA, professional basketball, played in Chicago for several years. The girl's only 24 years old, and you'd think she was much younger, or much older rather, than how old she is, because she's just overcome more than most people can even fathom overcoming in their entire life, in her first 24, 25 years of life.
Absolutely, and as I said, a lovely young lady, and again, I was just bowled over by her story, and we wish her well, and we wish her the best in her hopefully long WNBA career for sure. And as you said, the subject of suicide in society today is just off the charts. Everywhere you turn around, there's unfortunate stories literally every day of famous, not so famous, and it's important to remember it doesn't matter where you are in that stratosphere, is that if one needs help, there are places to reach out and get counseling and get help to try to overcome and move on with your life for sure. We'll go, I guess, with George on this one. I'm not sure. A gentleman that I knew his story, but I did not know that he was the one featured in the book till I started reading his chapter. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his name. Tom Gamboa, former Major League coach, scout, former minor league manager, most recently with the Brooklyn Cyclones, Mets, I believe, single-A affiliate. He survived an attack by 2 fans in Chicago. George was not one of them, by the way. During a White Sox-Royals game in September 2002, while coaching first base. And when I read that, I said, I remember this. And I remember thinking, these 2 guys, shirtless guys, come out there and they start pummeling this guy. And what struck me And this was, just to give it a point of reference, was pre or post 9/11 in 2002. And there was a photograph, I don't think we have it, but where the first baseman and the umpire are like kind of not even reacting at first. And I just thought, I don't know if George, you remember seeing that in the media. You were obviously living out there. What the heck was going on? Was it just people just couldn't believe what they were seeing?
Well, I think they were stunned. Who would think that a father and son shirtless duo would just jump out of the box seats and attack the first base coach without provocation? This was a troubled man, William Legoo, who brought his teenage son to the ballpark. He had had a background of some, I believe, substance abuse issues, and his son followed him out there, and they just jumped Tom Gamboa, and there just was not time to react until some damage was done. And Tom, who had been a baseball lifer, I got to know him when he was the Cubs third base coach in 1998 and 99, moved on to the Kansas City Royals. No provocation, and before the security could get there, he had sustained some injury to his ear. He had lost some hearing as a result. The Lagoos ended up, going through the justice system. I think the father eventually was released, but the son was recalcitrant, and many years later expressed pride that he had been involved in the attack, which is really, really sorry. It just shows you talked about suicide a few minutes ago. Mental health and inattention to it is one of the crying problems in society. But we won't get into that. There's just not enough time. Now, Tom Gamboa, the unfortunate thing was he paid for the attack. He didn't do anything. He paid for the attack with his job, because the Royals over the next year got tired of all the media flocking to Gamboa. On the first anniversary, he was just bombarded by media, and the Royals were not understanding. They were a poorly run organization at the time, and eventually they booted him off the staff because they did not like Tom being the center of attention with all these media. So it was something right out of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Wrong Man. And he has to try to prove his innocence. He has to try to prove his worth. And eventually, Roland Heeman, he couldn't find a job for a year or so. Roland Heeman, the veteran executive, been with the White Sox, Orioles, Diamondbacks, had connections in the Mexican League, and got Tom a managing job down there. And eventually he found his way back into professional baseball. So all's well that ends well. Tom got to leave the game in 2017 on his own terms. He got to retire from that Brooklyn Cyclones job, and I've been following him on Facebook. He's literally doing a world tour, and so I keep asking him, shouldn't you be waving around runners? And he certainly likes that reminder of his coaching things. But it's an example that sometimes you could be the victim of just absolute circumstances, not of your own. And if you don't lose faith in yourself, that's the first part, but you need some help from some friends. And fortunately, Tom Gamboa got that from Roland Heeman to get back in the game.
Absolutely. And in the book, when you mentioned about the Chicago Cubs, he was the third base coach who, when Sammy Sosa, for many years, but especially during those 2 years in 98, 99, he got to be the one with the high fives or the low fives whenever Sammy would hit one of those many, many home runs that he hit. How he hit them, that's another story. But Tom was the third base coach, as you mentioned, so that was certainly. We have a shot of actually Tom with the Brooklyn Cyclones with Jose Reyes. Jose was during one of his, I think, minor league rehab stints, and a wonderful shot of Tom in his Brooklyn Cyclone uniform with all-star infielder Jose Reyes. So again, our best, and I understand Tom has a book, so hopefully we'll be contacting him. Would love to talk to him about his very lengthy career as well. Champions, the book, 15 Inspiring Comeback Stories from Sports and Life. George Castle, returning guest as well as first-time guest co-author John Schenk joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. For more information, signaturestrengthpublishing.com. We'll turn it over to John. John, help me with this one here. I don't want to mispronounce this young lady's name. Israeli Paralympic basketball and world champion rower. What can you tell me about? Is her last name Samuel?
I believe that's correct. George is actually the one that did the interview and has the relationship with her.
Yeah, I'll be glad to take this one if you don't mind.
Where
it's
George
a good
went to Chicago.
double play relay there,
so
John.
he could probably actually give you a little more information about kind of her background and how he got to know her.
Okay, George, give us like a 2-minute synopsis of this fine athlete, 2015 World Para Rowing Athlete of the Year.
Yeah, I found out about her. I wanted to get some more women athletes in the book, and I happen to know people at the Israel Consulate of the Midwest here in Chicago. And Moran Bierman, who's their Counsel for Public Diplomacy, mentioned Moran Samuel, and he got me in touch with her. And we had a wonderful phone conversation. It turns out that she was a pretty good basketball player in Israel, and that was her profession, her career. But one day, literally a bolt out of the blue, she suffered a spinal stroke, and that meant that she was paralyzed from below her chest through the rest of her body down to her feet. So what are you going to do? She had the competitive instincts, but she couldn't play basketball anymore. What does she do? She takes up rowing, competitive rowing, and she became a champion rower because you just need your upper body above the area where the paralysis took place. And in the meantime, while she was a competitive rower and adjusted to it, she was raising a young child with her wife. And she expressed a little bit of sorrow that she couldn't run and play with the kid, but she was just as involved of a mother, along with being an athlete, as a mother who has 2 good legs. So her story continues, and again, I really appreciate the help of the Israel Council for the Midwest, or Consulate of the Midwest, for getting me in touch with her. And that's a very, very good story in terms of the theme of the book of personal comebacks in the wake of a lot of things that are beyond our control.
Absolutely, and we've got a shot of Ms. Samuel actually in action. Again, 2015 World Para Rowing Athlete of the Year. A fine individual. Enjoyed her story immensely. Again, the book Champions, 15 Inspiring Comeback Stories from Sports and Life. George Castle, John Schenk joining us for the hour. signaturestrengthpublishing.com. We'll turn it back to John. John, tell me a little bit about Dr. Rick Lehman, orthopedic surgeon to many of the sports stars. Interesting chapter near the end of the book. The mind needs to heal as much as the body. And when I read that, I thought of so many players, especially when Tommy John surgery, for instance, wasn't as automatic as it seems to be today. I always noticed that one guy in particular that stands out, I remember Oral Hershiser, the great Dodger pitcher, when he was with the Indians, had to have what amounted to Tommy John surgery. And, at this point, obviously the process had come along a little bit, but I remember that he tried to rush it back a little bit, and then, the arm and maybe the mind wasn't quite there, so he struggled a little bit because, again, in this day and age when dollars and cents are involved, I think players sometimes are being rushed either by their employers or perhaps within themselves. Tell me a little bit about Dr. Lehman and his work.
Well, Dr. Lehman has one of the most premier sports practices, I'd say, in America in terms of orthopedic surgery. He's taken care of a very large and elite list of the top professional athletes in the country, and he's done several Olympic athletes and so on. And I think the interesting and unique part about Dr. Lehman is that he sees it and he understands this from a doctor and a medical perspective, being one of the revolutionary doctors behind some of the procedures that they use now in orthopedics. But he also understands it from a parent's perspective, being the father of several children. And then also from a owner's standpoint, he was part owner of the Florida Panthers for many years. He's been a team doctor for several NHL teams for years and years outside that. And so kind of having those unique perspectives, I think one of the things that really sets Dr. Lehman apart and makes him such a favorite doctor to youth athletes especially, and professional athletes, is his bedside manner, his dedication to his patients, going out of his way to text them, see how their game's going, to see how their recovery's going, and kind of stick along with them during that process. But also just seeing it from the mind, like you said, just seeing it from the psychological standpoint of kind of the setbacks that come along with that. In the book, Dr. Lehman says that he doesn't care who you are or what athlete you are, you're going to have a form of post-surgical depression in some way, whatever way that looks. But what Dr. Lehman does is he goes out of his way to nurture and to care for those athletes in those times to make sure that they don't get too caught up in the mind, that post-surgical depression doesn't defeat them, and that they continue to make the progress to continue to be elite athletes. So I think that's what really sets Dr. Lehman apart. He gets requests all the time. In fact, we're doing a book with Dr. Lehman. It's kind of a handbook for parents, if you will, some of the most common issues that youth athletes face. And so he's very well established in what he does, but more so and more important than that, he's got some really great recommendations for athletes that may be suffering from some of the injuries that these other 14 athletes in the book talk about.
I look forward to hearing more about the good doctor. I know there was something I just read, John, the other day, and again, sometimes, with all the steps that apparently are taken, I just read a statistic that in the sport of football, although it can happen in any sport, even baseball, concussions last season were at like a 6 or 8 year high. So it's like we're taking steps, we're changing the game, and in some cases even the game of baseball, avoiding catching collisions. But I would love to, and we're working on trying to do a book about the concussion syndrome. I would love to, when that book comes out, be able to talk to the doctor to get his take, because it's just rampant. And the thing is, I'll turn to George on this comment. You and I may have talked about this off air. There was a player that you probably remember named Jason Bay, played with the Pirates, the Mets, Red Sox. He, I forget, he might have got kicked in the head or ran into a center field wall. Anyway, the guy was never the same again. And then people talk, well, a football player, maybe it doesn't impact their career. Imagine with holding a bat, and if your reactionary time is off even by a millisecond, and his career just totally went down the tubes. And I'm just curious, we'll start with you, George. Do you think that played a part in his career demise because of the concussions that he suffered?
Sure it did. We know so much more about concussions compared to 10 years ago. The NFL, in particular, may be in a semi-state of denial. I'm working, through, John Schenk on a book with Steve Zucker, the famous agent, and we deal with the issue of concussions. And Steve feels that within 15 to 20 years, we will not recognize football as we've known it, because football will be hurt. The talent base will dry up from the roots all the way up to the trunk. And you'll be left with basically poor kids who are playing football because it's a way to get to college, it's a way to get out of their living situation. But as Steve Zucker said, the mothers and the lawyers will squeeze the life out of football. So it's the knowledge that we have that is showing that football and other aspects of sports are inherently dangerous and brain damaging permanently to all sorts of athletes depending on the severity of the blow of the head. I know one of Steve Zucker's clients, Dave Duerson, who was on the '85 champion Bears and played for the New York Giants later in his career, committed suicide and did it on purpose by shooting himself in the chest so his brain could be preserved for CTE study afterwards. You talk about an unbelievable suicide, a selfless act to preserve the evidence. So the problem is medical knowledge moves on, and it's now starting to overwhelm our love of sports as we've known it. We're showing that, football in particular can be inherently dangerous, but you could sustain a brain damage from any other sport just due to blows of the head.
Absolutely. Again, the book Champions, 15 Inspiring Comeback Stories from Sports and Life. John Schenk, co-authoring with George Castle. Again, as we've talked throughout the hour, concussions, suicide, mental, physical abuse. I mean, so many storylines within the book. It's not meant to be a happy book or a sad book. It's a book that deals with reality and can probably be understood even by folks who are not necessarily sports stars or sports athletes like you and I. Again, just some tremendous stories. Unfortunately, we won't have time to cover them all. We've got Thomas Hollywood Henderson, I love, and I knew this before even I got the book, former Dallas Cowboy, great for a few years, played in I think 3 Super Bowls, won one. Later on in life, won the Texas Lottery. So, I mean, here's an example of where probably got out before he got knocked around too much, and then, wandered around a little bit. And then good fortune, as well as recovering from drug and alcohol abuse. There's something else that we haven't talked as much about. Kyle Schwarber, that I know George and I talked about when we were talking about the Cubs a couple of years ago with their World Series championship. Tom Gamboa, of course, fine career. Rich Hill, Casey McGahee, many from the world of sports. I noticed there's not a hockey one in there. So if you do champions too, because again, with hockey, I know again more head banging and sometimes not only hard hitting but hard living as well. So I can think of a few going back to my following the Rangers and the Bruins from my youth, guys that would certainly have some tremendous stories to tell with this book. Of course, I love the Bob Love one. Again, growing up watching that gentleman play, not knowing about some of these issues. Same thing with Ferguson Jenkins, Mark Pryor, former Major League pitcher. Again, I'll toss this first to George. Do you see an escalation with teams having these flamethrowers that flame out a lot sooner, or is it just more magnified now than when you and I were kids because of social media?
Well, I think it's more magnified and we understand the injuries. I'll give you a quick example. The Cubs had a pitcher named Bob Anderson, threw hard. He came up in 1958-59. He would actually take the commuter train and the subway to Wrigley Field from Hammond, Indiana, where he lived. And players did that more in those days. One day he's pitching to Roberto Clemente in 1961. Umpire did not give him a strike 3 on a close pitch. So Anderson had to throw another pitch. He felt a tug on his shoulder. This tug on the shoulder got worse and worse over the next couple of years until at age 28, Anderson was let go to the Detroit Tigers. He finally had to quit. Well, advance the clock to 1991, and Anderson sustained a left shoulder injury playing golf. So out of curiosity, the doctor pressed down on his right shoulder and, Anderson fell to the floor. It had been a rotator cuff injury that the doctors in 1961 did not know how to diagnose or treat. This was pre-Rick Lehman. And so what we know, you mentioned Tommy John surgery, what we've learned about injuries over the last 35 to 40 years and how to treat them, on one hand, we can repair the injury, but on the other hand, we still don't have the know-how to prevent it. And all that teams can do is set sometimes ridiculously low pitch counts to protect these pitchers. And things that we read about as kids about athletes toughing it out, playing every day, pitching every day, wouldn't be allowed now. But we just do not know how to do the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. There's no sure thing. We know how to treat the injury, but we don't know how to prevent it. So that's why we're seeing so many.
Absolutely. From World Series champs to Olympic gold medalists, athletes and coaches share some tremendous uplifting stories of turning tragedy into triumph. And this fine book, Champions, 15 Inspiring Comeback Stories from Sports and Life. It's been a pleasure to talk to the co-authors, George Castle, John Schenk. For more information, signaturestrengthpublishing.com. George, thank you for coming back on. We'll look forward to talking with you at a later date.
Thanks, Larry.
And John, a pleasure. We look forward. And hold up that picture there that George knocked off the wall. There, as I said, that's a great. And actually, if you check, let's see, signaturestrengthpublishing.com. Who knows? Maybe they still have a couple of those autograph ones that you can talk to them about. So again, thank you both for joining us. Hang in there for a second. And we'd like to thank you for spending some time with us here on Studio 411. Larry DeSilva is my name, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care.